When you're standing on the edge of a breakthrough, one of the most common battles you will face is the battle of discouragement. And here's the paradox: you often feel the weakest, the most worn down, and the most empty, not because you're far from your blessing, but because you're closer than you've ever been. It's almost like the final lap in a marathon. Runners often say that the hardest part isn't the first mile or the middle. It's that last stretch when your body feels like it has nothing left to give, but the finish line is just ahead. Spiritually, life works the same way. The closer you are to crossing into new territory, the louder the whispers of discouragement become. Discouragement is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of proximity. It's a sign that you are near enough to threaten the enemy's hold over your life. Because if the enemy can't stop God from opening a door, his next strategy is to stop you from walking through it, and the easiest way to do that is by convincing you that you're too tired, too broken, too late, or too unworthy to keep going. Think about that. Discouragement is not always based on truth. It's based on perception. It magnifies your problems and minimizes your progress. It tells you that what you've been doing is pointless, even when in reality you've been moving steadily toward the promise. Let's be honest, discouragement often doesn't come when things are terrible. It comes after you've been fighting faithfully for a long time. You prayed when you didn't feel like praying. You showed up when you wanted to quit. You kept sowing seeds, but the ground looked dry, and at some point you start to wonder, why am I doing this if I can't see the results? That's the voice of discouragement, and it's always loudest before the rain comes. If you look through Scripture, you'll find that some of the greatest breakthroughs were preceded by some of the darkest valleys of discouragement. Think about Elijah. This was a man who called down fire from heaven, who prayed and ended a drought, yet not long after his greatest victory, he found himself under a tree praying to die. Why? Because discouragement hit him at the very moment his ministry was about to shift into another dimension. Or consider the Israelites at the Red Sea. They had been delivered from Egypt, but when they stood before the water with Pharaoh's army behind them, discouragement made them cry out, "It would have been better if we stayed in Egypt." They couldn't see that the very waters in front of them were about to split and become the pathway to their breakthrough. What both of these examples show us is that discouragement has a way of blinding you to what God is doing right in front of you. It doesn't deny the existence of God, it just convinces you that he won't come through for you this time, and if you give in to that voice, you'll stop pressing right before the door opens. That's why you have to train yourself to see discouragement not as an ending, but as a signal. When discouragement shows up in full force, it's often heaven's way of telling you that the finish line is closer than you think. Now, let's go deeper. Psychologically, discouragement is linked to fatigue. Your brain literally begins to process challenges differently when you're exhausted. You stop weighing long-term vision and start obsessing over short-term relief. In other words, when you're discouraged, the temptation is to settle for less than, just because you're tired of waiting for greater than. But that's exactly why you have to keep your eyes fixed not on the weariness of the moment, but on the promise of what's ahead. Discouragement thrives when perspective shrinks. If all you can see is the pain of right now, you'll forget the progress you've already made. This is where faith becomes not just a religious concept, but a psychological weapon. Faith is the ability to look at dry ground and still declare, rain is coming. It's the courage to look at your Red Sea and say, if God brought me out of Egypt, he didn't bring me here to die. Faith does not deny reality, but it refuses to let discouragement have the final word. And that's what makes the difference between those who see their breakthrough and those who stop short. Sometimes the key is simply refusing to quit. Discouragement only has power if it convinces you to stop. Think about it. If you keep moving forward, even at a slow pace, you eventually reach the destination. The danger is in standing still, in letting discouragement paralyze you. That's why Scripture says, "Do not grow weary in well-doing, for in due season you will reap if you faint not." Notice the condition. It's not about if you're the smartest or the strongest, but simply whether you can endure discouragement long enough to see the harvest. So the next time you feel that heaviness pressing down, the next time your mind tells you it's not worth it anymore, recognize what's happening. You are in the battle of discouragement, and that battle is a sign that your breakthrough is dangerously close. Don't interpret the wait as failure, interpret it as confirmation. The enemy wouldn't be fighting you so hard if there wasn't something worth fighting over. And let me leave you with this thought. Discouragement is not proof that you're losing. It's proof that the enemy already knows what's coming. He knows you're on the verge of something greater, and his only hope is to make you quit before you get there. So when that heaviness comes, when you're tempted to lay it all down, remind yourself that the very presence of discouragement is evidence that the promise is near. Keep walking, keep pressing, keep believing. Because what looks like the hardest season of your life may be nothing more than the labor pains before the birth of something extraordinary. Closing statement. When discouragement tries to suffocate your spirit, don't see it as defeat. See it as a signal that you're one step away from destiny. Stand firm, because the breakthrough you've been praying for is closer than you realize. Another battle that always shows up when you're close to a breakthrough is the battle of distraction. And I don't just mean obvious distractions like scrolling endlessly through your phone or wasting time on meaningless activities. I'm talking about the subtle, sophisticated distractions that look harmless, even good, but slowly pull your attention away from what truly matters. Distraction doesn't always show up in the form of temptation. It often shows up in the form of busyness. And if the enemy can't destroy you, he'll try to keep you so preoccupied that you lose focus on the very thing God called you to do. This is one of the oldest tricks in the book. In fact, it's often not about making you do something sinful. It's about making you do something secondary. Think about Nehemiah. He was rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem, a God-given assignment, and his enemies kept trying to lure him into meetings, debates, and distractions. They weren't asking him to worship idols or commit obvious sins. They were simply saying, "Come down, let's talk." But Nehemiah's response was powerful. "I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down." And notice that he recognized that distraction wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a direct attempt to derail his destiny. And that's how distraction often works in our lives. Right before a breakthrough, opportunities, demands, and even people will come into your path, pulling you in different directions. It might be an unexpected responsibility, a relational drama, or even an exciting new door that has nothing to do with your purpose. At first glance you may think, this must be from God, but not everything good is God. Some things are designed to scatter your focus so that you don't have the energy or clarity to step into your real breakthrough. Philosophically, distraction is dangerous because it fractures the mind. A distracted person is not just busy, they are divided, and a divided mind can't produce fruit. Jesus himself warned about this in the parable of the sower when he described the seed that fell among thorns. He said that the word was choked by the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches. That's distraction. The seed wasn't bad, the soil wasn't bad, but the growth was suffocated because attention was divided. Now, if you really think about it, distraction is not always external. Sometimes the biggest distraction comes from within. You may not be distracted by other people, but you're distracted by your own fears, your own insecurities, your own overthinking. You start analyzing every detail, replaying every mistake, worrying about every possibility. And in doing so, you spend so much time in your head that you never actually move forward. That's why distraction can be more deadly than outright opposition, because it doesn't stop you with force, it stops you with fragments. It makes you leak energy little by little until you're too tired to keep pressing. And here's the irony, distraction usually intensifies right before promotion. Have you noticed that? The moment you decide to pray more, suddenly your schedule fills up. The moment you decide to fast, every craving seems 10 times stronger. The moment you commit to focusing on your goals, people start pulling you into endless side conversations or conflicts. That's not coincidence, that's spiritual resistance. It's the enemy recognizing that your focus is dangerous, so he sends distractions to scatter it. But let's go deeper into the psychology of it. Distraction thrives on immediacy. It tempts you with what looks urgent, so you neglect what is important. It convinces you that responding to every message, fixing every small issue, or pleasing every person is the priority, while the long-term vision God gave you quietly slips into the background. And the truth is, most people don't miss their breakthrough because they didn't love God or didn't want change. They missed it because they were too distracted to notice when the door opened. That's why discipline is the antidote to distraction. Discipline is not about legalism or rigidity. It's about clarity. It's about recognizing what matters most and refusing to let lesser things steal that focus. Nehemiah understood that. Jesus modeled that. Even Paul said, "This one thing I do." He didn't say, "These 10 things I dabble in." He narrowed his focus because he knew that divided attention leads to diluted power. So when you find yourself close to breakthrough and the phone won't stop buzzing, when drama keeps knocking on your door, when endless tasks keep screaming for your attention, you have to pause and ask yourself, is this pulling me closer to my purpose, or is it pulling me away? That one question could save you years of wasted time, because the truth is the enemy doesn't have to destroy you if he can distract you. A distracted person can live their whole life busy but never fruitful. And sometimes distraction even wears a mask of importance. Have you noticed that? Someone suddenly needs you for something urgent. A new opportunity shows up that looks glamorous. A conflict arises that demands your emotional energy. None of these things are inherently wrong, but if they're not aligned with your assignment in this season, they are distractions. And when you're close to breakthrough, you don't have the luxury of scattering your focus. Think about an archer aiming at a target. If their eyes wander even slightly, the arrow won't hit the mark. It doesn't matter how strong the bow is or how sharp the arrow is. If the aim is off, the outcome will be too. Spiritually, it's the same. You could have prayer, gifting, and opportunity, but if your focus is fractured, your destiny will be delayed. So, the challenge is to train yourself to protect your attention as if it were a sacred resource, because it is. Your focus is one of the most valuable assets you have, and the closer you are to breakthrough, the more intentional you must be about guarding it. Let me leave you with this: distraction will always appear before elevation. But you don't have to take the bait. Like Nehemiah, you can look at the interruptions, the noise, and the unnecessary battles and say, "I'm doing a great work, and I cannot come down." Because if the enemy can't take your calling, his next best hope is to take your concentration. Don't let him. Closing statement: when distractions rise against you in the moment of breakthrough, remember this. Your focus is your weapon. Guard it fiercely, because where your attention goes, your destiny flows. Another battle that always seems to rise when you are close to a breakthrough is the battle of doubt. And doubt doesn't always show up as some loud, aggressive thought screaming, "This won't work." Often it slips in quietly, whispering just enough uncertainty to make you second guess yourself, second guess God, and second guess the very path you've been walking. Doubt is subtle, but its power is crippling. If distraction scatters your focus, doubt corrodes your confidence. It paralyzes you from the inside out, making you question whether the vision you've been holding onto is even possible. You see this over and over in Scripture. The children of Israel had seen miracle after miracle. plagues in Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, manna from heaven. But the moment they stood at the edge of the promised land and saw the giants, they began to doubt. They said, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes," and noticed that they hadn't even fought yet. No enemy had lifted a weapon. The battle wasn't against swords or spears. It was against their own perception. Doubt had already defeated them before the first arrow was shot. And that's exactly what it does in our lives. Right before breakthrough, doubt convinces you that you're too small, too late, too unworthy, or too ill-equipped. Psychologically, doubt works by creating mental dissonance. It plants a seed of uncertainty that grows into hesitation, and hesitation, if not addressed, turns into paralysis, and paralysis at the wrong moment can cost you everything. Think about Peter walking on water. He was fine as long as he fixed his eyes on Jesus, but the moment he looked at the wind and the waves, doubt entered, and what happened? He began to sink, not because the storm grew worse, but because his belief wavered. That's the danger of doubt. It doesn't have to change your circumstances. It only has to change your perception of them. Philosophically, doubt represents the clash between the finite and the infinite. Your finite mind tries to process an infinite God. You measure his promises by your resources, his calling by your capacity, his timing by your schedule. And when you can't reconcile the gap, doubt steps in as a false interpreter. It says if you can't see how it will happen, it probably won't. But faith doesn't require you to see how, it requires you to trust who. The problem is, doubt doesn't just live in the intellect, it lodges itself in the heart. It preys on old wounds and past disappointments. Every failure you've experienced becomes fuel for doubt. It whispers, "Remember the last time you tried, you failed. Remember when you trusted and it didn't work out. What makes this time different?" That's why battling doubt is not just about reasoning your way out. It's about reprogramming your spirit to see God's faithfulness as greater than your history. And here's where it gets dangerous. Doubt is contagious. Spend enough time around doubters and their uncertainty becomes your own. You see this in Numbers when the 10 spies spread their fear to the entire camp. Only Joshua and Caleb stood firm, declaring, "We can take the land." But the majority voice of doubt drowned out the minority voice of faith. And an entire generation missed their breakthrough because they believed the wrong report. That's why when you're near your breakthrough, you have to be intentional about the voices you allow to shape your perspective. Surround yourself with people who remind you of what God said, not those who only point out what the giants look like. But let's not oversimplify this. Doubt is not always unbelief. Sometimes it's the growing pains of faith stretching you into new territory. Even great men and women of God wrestled with doubt. Abraham laughed when God told him he would have a son. Gideon asked for multiple signs before he accepted his calling. Thomas refused to believe until he saw the wounds in Jesus' hands. The presence of doubt doesn't mean the absence of faith. It just means your faith has entered a battlefield, and the key is not to eliminate doubt entirely, but to refuse to let it dictate your actions. That's where spiritual promotion comes in. When God is about to elevate you, he allows you to confront doubt so that your faith muscles are strengthened. Faith that has never wrestled with doubt is shallow. But faith that has looked doubt in the face and chosen to believe anyway, that's unshakable. That's the kind of faith breakthroughs are built on. So how do you overcome doubt when it shows up right before your breakthrough? You do it the same way Jesus did in the wilderness, by speaking truth louder than the lie. Doubt says, "You can't." God says, "I can through you." Doubt says, "You're not enough." God says, "My grace is sufficient." Doubt says, "Look at the storm." God says, "Look at me." The battle is not about denying reality, it's about choosing which reality to give authority to, the one you see or the one God promised. And here's something practical. Don't wait until you're drowning in doubt to build your faith. Store up reminders of God's faithfulness in the quiet seasons, so you have ammunition when doubt attacks in the critical moments. That's why David could face Goliath without hesitation. He remembered the lion. He remembered the bear, and he said, "The same God who delivered me then will deliver me now." His faith wasn't naive, it was anchored in memory. The truth is, doubt will knock on the door of every breakthrough. But you decide whether to let it in. If you entertain it, it will drain your courage. If you resist it, your faith will rise stronger. And here's the paradox. Sometimes the very presence of intense doubt is evidence that you're closer to breakthrough than ever before. Why would the enemy fight your confidence if you weren't standing on the edge of something significant? So, the next time doubt creeps in and tells you that you're not ready, not worthy, or not capable, flip the script. Take it as a sign that you are closer than you think, because the intensity of doubt is often proportionate to the magnitude of the destiny waiting on the other side. Closing statement: when doubt shows up before your breakthrough, don't see it as a signal to retreat. See it as confirmation that you are standing on the edge of promise. Doubt may whisper, but faith roars. Choose the roar. Another battle that often rises with great intensity when you're on the brink of breakthrough is the battle of fear. Fear is one of the most primal and powerful forces in human experience, and it has a unique way of showing up right when the stakes are highest. It doesn't usually attack when nothing significant is happening. It waits until you are standing at the threshold of something new, something bigger than yourself, something that could redefine your life. That's when fear unleashes its grip, hoping to stop you from stepping into the very thing you were created for. Now, fear in itself is not always irrational. At its core, fear is the body and mind's response to danger. It's protective. It's what keeps you from touching a hot stove or walking into traffic. But when fear becomes misapplied, when it attaches itself not to real danger but to imagined failure, rejection, or inadequacy, it becomes a prison. And that's what happens to many of us as we near breakthrough. The fear doesn't come because what's ahead will destroy us. It comes because what's ahead will transform us. Fear has always been one of the enemy's oldest weapons. In the wilderness, the Israelites weren't defeated by giants. They were defeated by the fear of giants. That fear magnified the obstacle until it seemed insurmountable, even though God had already promised them victory. Think about that. Fear has the power to make what is already yours look inaccessible. Fear builds walls where God has already opened doors. And if you're not careful, fear will convince you that your breakthrough is impossible, even as you stand in the very land God has prepared for you. Psychologically, fear narrows your vision. Neuroscientists tell us that when fear is activated, the brain goes into a survival mode. Your field of focus becomes narrow, and your ability to think creatively or strategically diminishes. Fear literally hijacks your imagination, but instead of using imagination to envision God's possibilities, you use it to rehearse your worst-case scenarios. That's why people paralyzed by fear often say, "I just can't see a way forward." It's not that there isn't one, it's that fear has blinded them to it. Philosophically, fear is the opposite of love. Scripture reminds us that perfect love casts out fear. Why? Because love anchors you in relationship with God, while fear detaches you from trust in Him. Fear thrives on disconnection. It isolates you from truth, from confidence, and from the security of God's promises. Love, on the other hand, keeps you grounded. It reminds you that even if the path is unfamiliar, the God who called you is faithful. So when fear shows up at the edge of breakthrough, it's not just a psychological struggle, it's a spiritual one. It's a test of whether you will place more trust in the voice of fear or the love of God. Let's be real, fear is not always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet hesitation that keeps you from moving. Sometimes it's not a scream, but a whisper that says, "Not now, you're not ready, maybe later." That's why fear is so dangerous. It doesn't always stop you abruptly. It often delays you indefinitely. And delay is one of the enemy's most effective strategies, because delayed obedience is disobedience in disguise. If God has already said go, and you are waiting until the fear subsides, you will never move, because fear doesn't leave until you act. Think of Joshua standing before the walls of Jericho. The city was fortified, the gates locked, the walls impenetrable. And yet God told Joshua to march, to shout, to act, not after the walls crumbled, but before. Fear would have said, "Wait until the walls crack, then believe." Faith said, "Believe, and the walls will crack." The only way to silence fear is to step forward in obedience despite it. This is where many people miss their breakthrough. They wait for the fear to go away before they act, not realizing that courage is not the absence of fear. It is movement in the presence of it. The difference between those who inherit their promise and those who don't is rarely the absence of fear. It is their response to it. Some allow fear to immobilize them, while others let fear become a cue that they're moving in the right direction. I want you to consider this. If fear intensifies as you approach breakthrough, maybe it's not a sign that you're in danger. Maybe it's a sign that you're on the verge of destiny. Fear doesn't fight what isn't threatening. The enemy doesn't waste energy on people going nowhere. If fear has targeted you, it's because there's something in you worth targeting. And here's the paradox. Fear, when confronted, becomes fuel. It sharpens you. It forces you to rely not on your strength but on God's. It reminds you that if you could do it on your own, it wouldn't require faith. That's why so many breakthroughs are preceded by fear, because God is positioning you for something that requires His presence, not just your power. So, how do you battle fear in those critical moments? You face it with truth. You don't pretend it isn't there. You acknowledge it, but you don't give it authority. You speak God's promises louder than fear's threats. You remind yourself that fear is temporary, but obedience leaves eternal impact. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is take one small step in the face of fear, because once you move, fear begins to lose its grip. You may never feel ready, you may never feel strong enough, but readiness is not the condition for breakthrough. Obedience is. God doesn't need you to be fearless, He needs you to be faithful.